uh, the chapters of this book, Life on the Edge. And today we have a great speaker, Professor Davies from University of Arizona State. So he has got his PhD from University of College London in 1970. And he has mostly worked on astrophysics and cosmology, also quantum properties of black holes. And he's also very interested in the origin of life. And he has like almost 30 super interesting books. I will share the link here in the chat. You can have a look. So we are having him today. So he will talk about chapter 9 of the book, Life on the Edge, which is about how life began. So yeah, Professor Davies, if you want to add anything, so now you can start. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everybody, whoever you are and wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm in Arizona, in Phoenix, Arizona, where I work at Arizona State University. And as you heard, by profession, I'm a theoretical physicist and cosmologist. And so most of my life, I have been working on the problem of how the universe began. There are really three great origin problems: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin of consciousness. And I would say that after a few decades of work, we really do understand the origin of the universe quite well. When it comes to the origin of consciousness, I think we don't even know how to frame the right concepts. It may be that we will never have a full grasp of that scientifically. The origin of life occupies a sort of middle position. I think it's possible that we will have a full understanding of the origin of life, but we're very far from that at the moment. And some of my research is directed these days towards trying to define life, what is life, but also to figure out how it began. And in the context of this particular lecture series, of course, we'd like to know, did life emerge out of the quantum ferment in some way? Clearly, the story of life begins with molecules. And so in this bottom-up approach, we might expect quantum mechanics to play an important role. But I think the origin of life is still deeply mysterious, as I'm going to explain to you. And so what I will do now is to transition to a PowerPoint presentation. And so the first thing is I must share the screen, if I can remember how to do all that. For some reason, I'm not seeing the screen share come up. Just bear with me. Let me just close that down. I don't see. Now I think I understand what's going on. So if I go here, I guess after this time of COVID, we really ought to be completely proficient at using Zoom with screen sharing. Now I finally have the right link here, and I'm sharing the screen, but you're not seeing the talk, which you will be in a moment. And now I have to go to this out the way. And I'd like some feedback to make sure everybody can now see the title slide. Could somebody confirm that that is good?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So here we have the title slide. Well, 170 years ago, the biologist Charles Darwin gave us a wonderful theory that explains how life on Earth has evolved over billions of years from simple microbes to the complexity of the biosphere that we see today. But Darwin conspicuously left out of account how life got started in the first place. One of my favorite Darwin quotes is, "It is mere rubbish. Thinking at present of the origin of life, one might as well think of the origin of matter." And as a physicist, I always like to point out that we physicists have now explained the origin of matter, but when it comes to the origin of life, I think it's just as tough today, almost as tough as it was 170 odd years ago when Darwin wrote his famous book. But the puzzle of life's origin is really three puzzles together. It's when, where, and how. And let me just take each of these in turn. First of all, when did life begin? Well, our planet the solar system is only about a third as old as the universe. And so at the moment, let me just concentrate on the solar system. When did life appear in the solar system in its 4.5 billion year history? Well, the oldest traces of life on Earth that are generally agreed are found in this region of Western Australia called the Pilbara. I was just there last month, as a matter of fact. And if you go there, it's a difficult journey. You have to fly to Port Hedland and then get in a vehicle that the locals call a bush basher and drive out into the bush for a few hours. And you come to these hills with outcrops that are dated at 3.5 billion years old. And so I went there many years ago. It's a very younger looking version of me. And if you look at these rocks, they have these strange little features. There we are. And they're fossilized examples of what are known as stromatolites. So stromatolites themselves are not living things. They're microbial mats. So if microbes exist in a layer, perhaps in a tidal zone, they deposit minerals and then the next year deposit some more and so on. And they build up this layered structure. And this obviously was happening 3.5 billion years ago, and it's become fossilized into these structures here. It's possible to see living stromatolites today. If you go about a day's drive south of the Pilbara Hills, you get to this place called Shark Bay, and if you brave the sharks, you can see examples of these microbial mats, these living stromatolites. So if you got in a time machine and went back 3.5 billion years, then you would indeed see something like this. So that's life on Earth would look just like this, you see, sort of rather dull compared to what it is today, but nevertheless of that sort of age. It's possible that there's traces of life in Greenland in rocks dated about 3.8 billion years, but that's disputed. Now, the issue here is easily described. The solar system didn't just form overnight. There was a long period in which the planets accumulated material. The planetary nebula, gas and dust and materials swirling around the sun, took a long time to settle down before the planets swept up all that debris. And in a sense, they've never settled down because the planets are continually being bombarded with rocks from space. And in the early days, this bombardment was really very intense. Indeed, our moon, our very own moon, which, if anyone's interested, next Wednesday evening will pass across the planet Mars. This is called an occultation in astronomy. You might want to look out for that. It's visible from California, not from some parts of the world, early evening next Wednesday. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The moon was formed by a Mars-sized object slamming into Earth in the early stages. So it was a very violent time. And this heavy bombardment didn't really settle down until about 3.7 billion years ago. Although, as I've explained, it's never really gone away. You probably know that dinosaurs were done in by an asteroid slamming into Earth 65 million years ago. So we have a bit of a, not a paradox, but a surprise that the traces of life on Earth go back almost to the time of this late heavy bombardment. And so this suggests to many that life is easy to get going. I'm going to come back to that point because it may not be true. Let me pass on to, so as far as when did life establish itself on Earth, not necessarily when did it begin, when did it establish itself on Earth? At least 3.5 billion years ago. Where did life begin? Well, there are many theories as to the setting. Almost all of these theories insists that there must have been liquid water, Darwin himself conjectured, although he didn't want to be drawn on how life began, he conjectured that there was what he called a warm little pond somewhere on the Earth's surface, and that under the effects of the energy flux of sunlight, chemicals leached into the pond by the surrounding rocks would have complexified over time, maybe over immense periods of time, maybe millions of years, until eventually something, crawled out of the pond, and that was as far as he got. And so that idea of a sort of primordial soup in a little pond really was a very popular one for quite some decades. But given this bombardment that I've been talking about, a warm little pond on the Earth's surface would seem to be a very insecure location for life to be incubated. And other ideas have emerged since. One that is my favorite is we've now discovered that there's not just life on Earth, there's life in Earth. That is, microbial life penetrates deep down under the ground and beneath the seabed to a depth of some kilometers. Nobody quite knows how deep, but certainly very deep. It's been estimated there might be as much biomass hidden in the Earth as there is on the surface of the Earth. And it would seem that if you're in a violent environment where the biggest of these impactors would have sterilized the Earth's surface, boiled the ocean, so much energy was released, swathed the Earth in incandescent rock vapor, it would be a very dangerous environment to get going. And so for my money, I think life probably began deep down and came to the surface at a later time. I sometimes use this Marie Antoinette paraphrase, which not everybody understands. I'm not going to go into it. There is another exotic possibility, which is that life on Earth didn't start on Earth at all, but on another planet and came to Earth. This same bombardment I've been talking about affected Mars as well as Earth. Indeed, photographs of Mars will show it's covered in craters, just like the moon. Earth would have been covered in craters as well, but the trace of those has been erased by tectonic activity and weathering. But on Mars, where there isn't any tectonic activity, those craters are still there. And this bombardment, from time to time, asteroids and comets hit Mars with enough force to project rocks all around the solar system, and some of these rocks come to Earth. Our university has about a dozen rocks from Mars that have fallen as meteorites. And so cocooned inside a rock, blasted off Mars, a microorganism would be shielded from the harsh conditions of space and could travel fairly easily to our planet and plop down in the oceans here and colonize Earth. It would find a rather congenial environment. Of course, it would work the other way. Rocks blasted off Earth would go to Mars. The key point is that Mars and Earth are not quarantined from each other. They never have been, and they're not now. And so if you get life on one of these planets, you'll get it on both. And maybe the reason that life started so quickly after the conditions settled down here is because it was already established on Mars, where the effects of the bombardment would have been less severe because it's a smaller planet and it has less oceans to boil and other reasons. That's not a definitive argument, but it's suggestive. And it just means that when we're thinking about where did life begin, where did life on Earth begin, we shouldn't assume it did begin on Earth. It could easily have begun somewhere else and come to Earth. Sometimes that's called the theory of panspermia. I won't get into that in detail unless it comes up in question time. The hardest part of the whole origin of life story is the how part. How did non-life turn into life? How can such a thing happen? Life is, of course, so extraordinary, so complex, so very specific in its properties that it's clear such a thing didn't arise just by the random shuffling of molecules. One would wait pretty much forever. So there must be some other part of this story, things we don't know what that is. So when I was a student, the prevailing view well summed up here, somewhat sexistly, by Jacques Monod, a Nobel Prize-winning biologist, in his book Chance and Necessity, or Chance et Nécessité. Man at last knows that he is alone in the unfeeling immensity of the universe, out of which he emerged only by chance. So, in other words, life is a bizarre freak accident, and it will happen only once. And that view was echoed by Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the structure of DNA. Life seems almost a miracle, he wrote. So many of the conditions for it to get going. So the view when I was a student was life is so peculiar, so unusual that it would never happen twice in the universe. About 20 years later, this view, the pendulum had swung, and this view seemed to have been abandoned, at least by some scientists. So Christian Davies, another Nobel Prize-winning biologist, said in this book, life is almost bound to arise wherever physical conditions are similar to Earth. And he has a wonderful phrase, life is a cosmic imperative. In other words, that the universe is rigged in favor of life. You just have to wait and it will pop up wherever conditions are appropriate. And so that's the idea that the universe is teeming with life. So in 20 years, we've gone from life is a bizarre freak, a near miracle, to it's everywhere. And you might think, well, that's because a lot was discovered about the origin of life in that 20 years. Nothing, virtually nothing was discovered, almost nothing changed. So this is a good example of scientific sociology at work. The fashion turned, the pendulum swung in those 20 years. And it's now very fashionable for scientists to say the universe is teeming with life. This is a quote from Mary Wojtek, formerly the director of the NASA Astrobiology Institute, who said, with all the other planets around, all the other stars, it's impossible to imagine that life wouldn't have arisen somewhere else. And so you see the sentiment has changed. But what about the science underpinning this? How could one arrive at this conclusion? Well, I already mentioned this quote by Darwin, it's mere rubbish thinking of the origin of life. And today, we are just as much in the dark. We don't know the physical pathway by which non-life turned into life, by which a mishmash of chemicals transformed itself into a truly living thing. The simplest living things we know, small bacteria, are already stupendously complex. And it's obvious that such a thing would not appear in one amazing, gigantic chemical reaction. There must have been a long, complicated pathway. We don't know what that pathway was. We can guess certain bits of it, like the beginning and the end, perhaps, but we don't know the details. And if you don't know what a process is, you can't work out the probability that it will happen. I get infuriated by journalists who often ask me, how likely is it that we're going to discover aliens or something in my lifetime? And I get angry because I say, the question is utterly meaningless. I can only give a likelihood if I know the process. I can only estimate the probability. If you tell me how something happened, I can have a go at figuring out how likely it is to happen somewhere else. But if you say to me, well, I don't know how it happened, so how likely is it to happen somewhere else? I can't give an answer. How can I? Contrast this with evolution itself, because we know the process. We know how microbes have been transformed over billions of years into trees and elephants and people. We know that process. It's called evolution by mutation and natural selection. As a matter of fact, we still can't actually work out the probability if you come back after a billion years once microbes have formed that you will have multicellular organisms. We don't know how to do that calculation, but at least we know what the process is. We have no idea of the process that turned non-life into life. So I really want to stress that point. So we can't put a number to it. So you can, it's fashion. You can pick anything between a bizarre fluke, as was fashionable when I was a student, to some sort of inevitable self-organizing life principle work in the universe, which seems to be the fashion today. What I might say is, many people talk about a life principle. They say that the universe is rigged in favor of life, that the laws of physics, the chemical processes of the universe favor the production of life. But if there is a principle underlying it, it's not there in the laws of physics. There's nothing in the laws of physics with life written in them. The laws of physics apply to everything. They don't make any special deal about life itself. So if there is such a principle, it's a new principle in science. We don't know it. We haven't discovered it. It may be there. It may exist. It may be that some of you listening to me now will go on and develop careers in trying to understand the nature of life and life in the universe, and will discover that there is indeed a law-like principle over and above the laws of physics that fast tracks matter to life. But I've never seen such a principle, and I don't know of one, and so therefore I'm completely skeptical about the fact that we live, that some people say we live in a universe teeming with life. I'm open-minded but skeptical. Now, let me just say, of course, we have to nuance this. It could be that there was one origin of life and it's diverged into many, many different life forms, that we might find that there is life beyond Earth. It may have spread there from some point of common origin and diverged to the point where we would think these are different types of life, different life forms. Conversely, convergent evolution might mean that life could start in many different ways and end up looking very much the same. Or the more popular view, there might be many origins of life and many lives which would descend from this. And all of these are possibilities. As we search our own planet and the universe beyond, we must be open to these possibilities. Now, some of you might be thinking, what about the fact that life got going so quickly at the beginning? Isn't this evidence that life is rather easy to make? And indeed, Carl Sagan, once a famous quote, said that the origin of life must be a highly probable affair. As soon as conditions permit, up it pops. And it's certainly true that the rapid appearance of life on Earth is consistent with it forming readily in Earth-like conditions. However, it's equally consistent with it being exceedingly hard to form in Earth-like conditions. And that was an argument that was pointed out by Brandon Carter, an astrophysicist and cosmologist, back in 1981 at a famous lecture at the Royal Society in London. I was there. I remember this lecture very much because Brandon Carter's not the most scintillating lecturer. He came on last, and it was a Friday afternoon or something, and everyone was getting a bit tired, and he went on for twice as long as he was allocated, and his slides, which were sort of hand-drawn in those days, were almost illegible. I remember this very well, but in fact, he was announcing a very profound result, which was written up some years later. And it's a simple argument that when we talk about life on Earth, we might think, well, that's it's a typical, we're sampling a planet that has life. But of course, what we must bear in mind is that we have post-selected that sample from an ensemble of planets that may or may not have life. We post-selected it by our very existence. And Carter's argument goes something like this, that if life hadn't started quickly on Earth, it wouldn't have had time to evolve intelligence before the sun became too hot and life on Earth would have been impossible. The window of opportunity for life to arise, you see, is about 4 billion years. And that would be typical of an Earth-like planet. You don't get forever to cook up life. It's got to occur in that window. And then it's a matter of simple probability theory, that if the emergence of intelligence involves a number of steps, n, say, and these steps have to be completed before there are observers like ourselves who then say, well, what's the probability of that happening? Then Carter came up with a simple formula. If there are n highly improbable steps, then the duration left between now and when the Earth sizzles, which is about 800 million years, gives you the step size, or tells you the number of hard steps which must have occurred between the origin of life and now. If it's 800 million years, you get about 5 or 6 steps. And it's very easy to think, one would be the origin of life itself, the other might be the origin of eukaryogenesis, the emergence of multicellularity and so on. Seems about right. And so what this is saying is that if life in the universe is exceedingly rare, wherever it does occur and there is intelligence following, then the life on that planet would have to get going very rapidly in order for intelligence to evolve. And I think it's a powerful argument. And so what it's telling us is that the rapid appearance of life on Earth is consistent with it being easy to make and consistent with it being very hard to make. And at this stage, with a sample of 1, we can't say any more than that. Now, how can we test this idea of the cosmic imperative? Because I'm going to work with this optimistic view that the emergence of life is not actually almost miraculous, that it is something that might happen again and again. How can we test the cosmic imperative? Well, we might look for a second genesis of life right here on Earth. No planet is more Earth-like than Earth itself. It's the most Earth-like planet we know. So if life does get going easily, as so many people seem to think and hope, then surely it would have happened many times over on our home planet. How do we know it didn't? Has anybody actually looked? And when I first came to Arizona State University and set up the Beyond Center for Fundamental Concepts in Science, the very first workshop I held was the possibility that there's more than one form of life on Earth. And over time, it became known as the idea of the shadow biosphere, that in addition to the biosphere we know and love, there could be a microbial biosphere interpenetrating the biosphere that we know, and would represent the descendants of a separate Genesis 2, if you like. So in other words, we can imagine, if we go back to the origin of life, life begins, it diversifies by Darwinism, and you have a tree of life, a famous tree that Darwin himself jotted down. And I'm now talking not about another branch on the same tree of life, but another tree altogether, and maybe a whole forest of trees. Maybe life started on Earth many, many times. Now, some people say, well, once life gets going, it changes the conditions that would favor life's emergence from non-life. And so it could only happen once. I'm not persuaded by that argument for reasons I don't have time to get into, but they may come up in question time. So we should look to see if in that vast microbial realm all around us, there are some microbes with radically alternative biochemistry that would represent life, but not as we know it. You can't tell by looking what those little blobs are. You have to delve into their biochemical innards and see what makes them tick. The vast majority of microbes on Earth have not even been classified, let alone cultured or sequenced. So we don't know what they are. And if 1% of them was something truly alien, you couldn't just tell by looking under a microscope. And so it's an open question as to whether all life on Earth is the same life. The textbooks will tell you it is, but that's not true. All life on Earth so far studied is the same life. But what about things we might have overlooked? If we found a radically peculiar microbe, there would be a dispute as to whether we're dealing with two trees or whether they have diverged deeper down. And that's a difficult thing to assess. This is the famous tree of life with the three great kingdoms, the eukarya, archaea, and bacteria. We might find that there's another branch, exotic branch of microbes that would just represent another branch on the known tree. But to establish that it's really is a separate genesis, there's a sort of sliding scale of differentness. We might look for a different genetic code. different suite of amino acids or nucleotides, some different type of translational machinery, not ribosomes, something else. There might be an information molecules, not DNA, a different polymer. Might even be different elements altogether. The one example that I think is very clear-cut is chirality, that all amino acids in known life are left-handed. In a mirror, they would look right-handed. This is one example. There's no particular reason. The laws of physics don't favor left over right. And so if life were to start again, it might very well be round the other way, with right-handed amino acids and left-handed sugars. And so that would stand out. That we could call it mirror life. There's been a little bit of an attempt to search for mirror life. It would be very hard to imagine a common origin of life and mirror life. You can't mix the left and the right very easily. So that's one thing we can look for. Now you might be thinking, well, what about making the life in the lab? There's this famous quote from Richard Feynman, what I cannot create, I do not understand. If we can make life ourselves in a test tube or something, then we would have a much better understanding of what it is. So that's certainly true. And there's been a long history of attempts to cook up life in the lab. A famous one, a Miller-Urey experiment back in 1952. What Stanley Miller did was get some gases that were thought at the time to be common on the early Earth in the atmosphere, and some water, and sparked electricity through it for a week and got this sort of brown sludge appearing, and that sludge contains many of the amino acids that life uses. And so there was a feeling at that time that, well, heavens, if Miller can cook up the building blocks of proteins in a week, if he had a budget to run the thing for 1 million years, surely he would make life. In other words, there was that assumption that somehow the chemical soup would be conveyed over time down a pathway with life as the destination. It would be some inexorable progress towards life. But as I pointed out earlier, the laws of physics and chemistry don't have life written into them. They know nothing about life, about that special state of matter that we call living matter. And so there's nothing inevitable about it. Indeed, all of the prebiotic soup experiments that have been done since Miller and Urey have got only a tiny fraction of the way down that pathway. And so the idea that, oh, well, life's origin is not such a mystery because we could already make amino acids or something, doesn't tell us much at all. It's like saying, it's like coming from some distant planet and finding New York City, saying, well, this looks an amazing, complex, self-organized or highly organized system here. How did that come to exist? And after a few years thinking, right, now I've discovered how to make a brick. So therefore, we've explained New York City because it's just lots of bricks. And we know that that's an absurd argument. So these prebiotic experiments, it's great that people do it, but I don't think it tells us really very much. The complexity of life is just so great that the building blocks don't really get us there. We don't know how to build a life meter. This is part of the problem. We can't tell with a chemical mixture, if it's immensely complex, whether it's living or not, or whether it's almost living or not very much living. The concept of livingness or aliveness doesn't seem to exist. We can't quantify it in the same way we might a magnetic field or something. And this is a very practical significance because NASA is planning a mission to Enceladus, which is a moon of Saturn, that's spewing out gases from a liquid interior. And the gases are known to contain organic molecules. And they want to fly through that plume and sample those molecules to see if it's life. And the question is, what do you look for? What suite of chemicals would be an unambiguous signature of life? And then if what you expect is not that you've got life, but you've got chemical complexity, which would, as it were, be part of the way to life, how would you assess how far down that pathway that I just showed you, a pathway going from simple building blocks to life at the end of it? If there is a pathway like that, how do we measure how far down that pathway we are? Nobody has a clue. Nobody really knows how to frame those concepts. I think there's a more fundamental reason why this approach to life's origin isn't going to work, because life is about much more than chemical complexity. If you go to a physics department and ask what is life, you'll be given a narrative in terms of things like matter and force and molecular shapes and binding and so on. But biologists don't talk about life that way. They talk about transcription and translation, that the genes are instructions, the code book of life is coded information. They talk about signaling molecules and all of those sorts of concepts. And these days, very much they talk about gene editing. We can re-edit the code book of life. We can take it and treat it as like an alphabet and rearrange it to make our own living things. And so life for biologists is all about information. And a handy definition is that life is indeed information and chemistry together in some combination. If you like, we can say it's about software and hardware. The prebiotic chemists are cooking up the hardware. Good luck to them. That's fine. But what about the software? Now, when it comes to information, this software is much more than the DNA that you all know about. Genes don't exist in isolation. They form complex networks that switch each other on and off. And so there's a flow of information around these networks in complex patterns that people study. And even entire organisms are very rarely on their own. They form colonies, and the signaling going on between them. They share information, form things like biofilms. And when we get to the realm of multicellular life, to social insects, for example, collective decision-making goes on. So there's information transfer between them, or in swarms of birds or bees, lots of information transfer taking place. And then if we think of the development of the embryo, say like the human embryo, that's an exquisitely choreographed process in which networks of information couple to chemical networks in order to make sure the right pieces are in the right place at the right time. All of that is a powerful example of how the software, it's not just bits of information, but it has a sort of managerial role in a way that is not really fully understood. And of course, there's that great information processing system between our ears, and no better example of the power of information in biology than the fact that animals have behavior, and it's not just all about matter. There's an obvious analogy with computers. To me, as a physicist, life looks like a miracle, and it looks like magic anyway, but so does a computer look like magic. And this is a screenshot I took some years ago, just after my wife and I visited the Taj Mahal in India. Typical, you might see your screen look something like this. And I can ask the question, well, how does Windows work? It seems to me it's like magic. And if I went to a computer science department and they opened up the back of the computer, I might be told a story like this. Well, we don't fully understand how Windows works, but we are very much on the case. We know there's some silicon in there, there's some copper, some iron, complex arrangements of things, but it's sort of made of those types of materials. And if we have a big enough budget, in a few years, we will work out exactly how Windows works in terms of this chemical complexity that we see there in the picture. And this is nonsense, because of course we do understand how Windows works, and you don't look in the back of the computer to get the answer. You go talk to a software engineer, and the software engineer will explain how the code was written based on earlier codes and so on. And will eventually, of course it's a very elaborate story, but eventually be able to explain how it is that Windows can, or Photoshop or PowerPoint or whatever, how these things actually work. So it looks like magic. It's not magic, but the real explanation lies not with the wiring, but it lies with the software engineering. And in the same way with life, I think that the real magic of life, why it can do all the amazing things it does, is not the stuff of which it's made. It's the way in which it's wired together, if you like, and the software, it's the information flowing around it, and in that managing role. It's the storage, processing, and transmission of information in a vast and elaborate web. And so to explain the origin of life, we have to explain not just the origin of the hardware, I think it's the easy part, but the origin of the software. And that's really a very tough thing. How is it that that molecules can write code? How is it that the super molecules can produce a system of coded molecular assembly and information transmission? We don't know, because we don't have any fundamental principle that can explain how matter and information couple to each other. We know from Maxwell's demon that there's a link between physics and information. That's understood, but that's just at the level of individual bits. What we're talking about here is information in a managerial role or a semantic role or a contextual role, which is something that we have no idea how such a thing comes into existence in the first place. It clearly did. The genetic code is a great example. It's coded, encrypted information storage and transmission and decryption. All of that has come into existence somehow. But how did the hardware itself sort it out without any laws and principles that govern the software or informational aspect? I think there's still a lot of science to be discovered. Anybody wanting to go into this field seriously needs to look at the idea that there's laws and principles governing the information, the software, if you like, which are consistent with but not reducible to the underlying laws of physics. We have to somehow see how these two different narratives, the hardware and the software, which run in parallel in computers and in living systems, how they couple together, but also how they emerged in the first place, spontaneously from some sort of chemical complexity. Big, big mystery in my view. John von Neumann, the co-inventor of the modern digital computer, was interested in these ideas back in the 1940s, and he came up with the idea of a self-constructing machine, or self-reproducing machine. The idea there is a very simple one. You can imagine a machine, these days we have them, which can be programmed to produce objects, automobiles or refrigerators or something. And if you imagine a general purpose machine, you might be able to program it to make anything that is physically possible, subject to the supply of the raw materials that it needs. So that would be like a universal constructor. But what von Neumann was interested in is what would happen if you asked the constructor to make a copy of itself. It's a little bit like a 3D printer, which is programmed to make another 3D printer. But the point that von Neumann spotted, which is really important, is that it's not enough to make the hardware, not enough to make the physical object with a self-reproducing machine. You've got to make a copy of the set of instructions as well, and put those instructions into the newly minted object. And so that's, again, hardware and software. But of course, it brings out the point that if you're duplicating a set of instructions as a physical object, it's playing the role of hardware. But when it's a program, it's playing the role of software. So it has a sort of dual role, exactly like life. You think, what is DNA as a physical object? But it's also a set of instructions. And when the cell's just chugging along, the DNA is being read out by some molecular machinery. And so the DNA is behaving like software. But then when the cell comes to replicate, the DNA has to flip roles. It then just becomes an inert physical object to be copied for the new cell. It's going to be copied, including any defects, any mutations that may have arisen. So it suddenly stops being actively spewing out instructions, if you like, and it just sits there, gets copied. And so the cell decides, in some manner we don't understand, what is the DNA today? Is the DNA software or is it hardware? It has both roles, and there's a sort of higher level system or higher level decision-making apparatus, which we don't fully understand, which enables the cell to toggle between the hardware and the software. But the dual nature is very clear in DNA. That's almost the end of what I had to say, because I want to allow a little bit of time for questions. I just want to mention one thing that many years ago I flirted with the idea that maybe quantum mechanics is not only important in the nature of life as it is now, but might have been explain the ultimate origin of life, that life somehow formed in the quantum realm. This is very speculative, but the point about the molecular or the quantum realm is that things happen much faster than they do on a macroscopic scale. And so if what you want to do is produce something very improbable, then maybe you should start out in a quantum system somewhere. So it has to be somewhere in the universe, not the surface of the Earth, I think, where quantum coherence can be maintained over a long period of time. I had in mind something like an interstellar grain well outside the solar system at a very low temperature, perhaps in a magnetic field, something of that sort. I'm not going to go into that in any more detail because it is wildly speculative, but the central idea is that life got going in the quantum realm originally, and that organic life is just like a sort of backup. And you can see in an obvious analogy with computers that the chip in your computer is very, very quick. That's why we can do all these miracles of software. It's very, very quick, but you turn the computer off and you lose that information. So it has to be backed up. In the old days, that was literally on a hard drive, which was a physical disk, robust, but very slow. And we can imagine that quantum life might have been so delicate, it would have recruited big clunky organic molecules as a backup storage for its information. And that over time, the backup itself sort of cut loose and became autonomous organic life that we now know, but its ultimate origins could be traced back to the quantum realm. Wildly speculative. I'm not putting that forward as anything other than an alternative way to think about life, but it's possible that ultimately life was actually born out of a quantum milieu with all the weirdness that goes with quantum physics that I'm sure you know about. And that's it, apart from my conclusion. These are the mysteries we're left with. How did software emerge from hardware? How did these stupid molecules blundering around come up with programmable instruction? And this, remember that life has both digital and analog information going on. The genetic code is a digital code. So life went digital a long time before humans discovered the power of digital technology. And that we have to somehow understand how information which is contained in genes and so on acquired functionality, biological functionality, is not just any old bits as you might have in junk DNA. All of these, I think, are open questions. And I hope I've convinced you in this rather rapid delivery that life's origin, many aspects of life's origin are still deeply mysterious, and the field is wide open to any of you who might like to come at it with a novel perspective. So at that point, I'm going to stop because I was told to allow 10 minutes for questions, and I think we have that ahead of us. And so thank you for your attention. I can simply get out of this thing, I think. Somehow I can stop sharing the screen and we can deal with questions.
Thank you so much for very interesting talk. I really enjoyed personally. So questions, yes.
I will leave you to moderate the questions.
Yeah, usually, I mean, we ask them to unmute themselves and then ask questions, or they can actually write questions on the chat, so we will ask you, yeah.
May I ask something? First of all, I'd like to congratulate you about your lecture. It was very good for me. I'm naive in terms of physics. I'm a doctor, simply a doctor. And the same way, I would like to ask you, the same way you talk about different forms of life, do you consider there must be different forms of consciousness? Like, is it necessary to have a brain to have consciousness, or do you believe the other forms of life, the very primitive forms of life, have some kind of consciousness also? I don't know if the question is very naive or something like this, but I would love to have your thoughts about it. Thank you very much.
Well, it is, of course, not a naive question. It's one that's been asked for at least 3,000 years, and there are many differences of opinion. There is, of course, a very old idea called panpsychism, that consciousness is distributed sort of everywhere in the physical world, and you don't need a brain to be conscious. That's not a very popular idea among neuroscientists. My own point of view is that you don't necessarily have to need a brain, but you do need some sort of information processing that is complex system. But these areas of inquiry are wide open. And I was interested that you said different kinds of consciousness. In fact, I'm on the board of trustees of a philanthropic foundation that has a whole program of research grants called kinds of minds, or types of minds. Of course, they're interested in things like artificial intelligence. Can we build a conscious computer, or insect intelligence, or collective intelligence, where you have, I showed the ants, collective decision making. That each individual ant might be rather stupid, but the colony as a whole could be intelligent. And so swarm intelligence, distributed intelligence, all of these things are worth thinking about. And I always like to mention the octopus that has its brain, if you like, distributed around its body. So it has bits in its tentacles that it thinks with its tentacles as well as with its head. So we don't fully understand the full nature of systems that are conscious. But I personally wouldn't think that a simple crystal would be conscious. I think it's got to be complex, and it's got to be dynamic. It can't just sit there. It's got to have a lot of things going on. Maybe not brains.
We have two questions. First, I will go to Juliana, and then I will come back to you, Paul. So Juliana is asking, is there any actual evidence that the beginning of life might be quantum, or this is merely a possibility?
No, I'm afraid no evidence whatsoever. I dreamt this up, one Saturday afternoon. In a weak moment, I wrote the paper. I really came at it from the point of view that the origin of life is so very hard that if you could speed the whole search process up by many orders of magnitude, that it would become easier. And that the way to do that is to look for a quantum system where things happen very, very quickly in the quantum realm. Because if the nature of life is simply informational complexity, you need complex, not just simple bits of information, but you need, the technical term that we use is algorithmic information. You need a lot of algorithmic information, and then you need replication. You need variation and replication, that one way you could do that is in the solid state. And there's an area of study called spin glasses, where you have a lot of complexity, and you have to figure out how to replicate those states somehow. But the whole idea was to just have it occurring maybe 10 to the 10 times faster than in a Miller-Urey type of soup. That was the basic idea. And that life as we know it took over the essential logic of quantum life, and it's left its quantum origins, the quantum cradle is sort of out there in space somewhere. We don't know. And I think the key point I want to get across is that the conditions in which life formed might be very different from the conditions in which life thrives. It could be that the formation of life is a very delicate affair, and it can't go anywhere unless it becomes more robust and can then leave the cradle. The cradle itself might be very, very vulnerable to external disturbances. That's the key point I think I was trying to get at.
Thank you. Paul, please unmute yourself and if you have a question.
Yeah, Paul Brummer at Toronto. Perhaps I missed it, but how are you defining life?
You didn't miss it, because that in itself would be not just one lecture, but an entire period of lectures. The hand-wavy definition that I threw in partway through is life is information plus chemistry, software plus hardware. That doesn't tell you very much at all. And I showed this picture of a life meter. Part of the reason that we can't measure how close a chemical soup might be getting to life is simply because we don't have a definition that we agree on. That we somehow we feel that we would know life when we know life when we see it, but this idea that there is a dividing line is a very hard one. So I think everybody agrees there's got to be a pathway, a chemical pathway from just simple chemicals, chemical mix, to, say a bacterium or some very simple living thing. But opinions differ as to whether, as you go along that pathway, there's something like a phase transition in physics, where, like a flame bursting out from hot gases, or whether it's just a seamless upward path, greater and greater chemical complexity, with nowhere that you can say, well, above this it's living and below this it's not living. And we don't know. I mean, I think we're missing a fundamental concept. I think we need a new idea to describe life, and not just talk about it in the terms I just have. It needs to be something radically new, and then we could come up with a better definition and have a better understanding. What would it mean to say, yes, life started in that lab or on that planet at such and such a time? At the moment, we don't have it.
Yeah. Thank you.
There is another question in the chat. Do you have a view that the apparent software of life could simply be electrical and is identical to the software for a computer? The question would be how biology interpret those electrical inputs and gradients. The memory could be patterns of electromagnetic fields or not. And obvious link to chemistry is electrochemistry, of course. Excuse if question is silly.
Of course, the processes in life that we know are fundamentally chemical or electrochemical. The electrical story is a really important one, because the living cell is a little bit like an electrical battery. It has a membrane potential of a few hundred millivolts that has to be maintained by pumping protons, and there's a whole story about electron chains inside that powers the whole thing. And so it is a little electrical system. But that's inevitable because we're dealing with chemistry, and chemistry is a branch of quantum electrodynamics. So that in itself is, I think, not the issue. The issue is whether the software architecture and the operating system of a computer bears some relation to the operating system in living organisms. I think there are similarities and there are differences. The similarities is obvious that if you think about DNA being read out and translated and then implemented in the form of proteins, that's very much like a communication channel where you have an encrypted message sent down the channel, decrypted at the other end, and if you have the key to the encryption, then that information becomes useful. So that much looks very much the same between computers and organisms. But I think the way in which information works and the feedback loops and so on in living matter are really very different. So I think it would be wrong to say that a supercomputer is a sort of living thing. They're both really good at processing information, but I think they do it in a fundamentally different way.
If I could ask, I mean, usually I think somewhat in symmetric ways when I look at fascinating problems like that. The part of the half of the symmetry is taking set of chemicals, and then the Mueller experiment sort of indicated how we go towards the life. The other symmetric part to the same idea would be you have already started the software and the chemistry together working for a living organism, and then at some point the second dramatic event is death. So a living thing becomes non-living. It has the same materials, same amount of hardware already present, but yet now it's dead. So I find this very amusing that maybe we should also study death as symmetrically as life, and maybe we should talk to people who study death as well.
Well, I agree entirely, and my colleague Sarah Walker at Arizona State likes to give a lecture called the Physics of Death, and just an amusing story, she once was unable to deliver her lecture on the physics of death and asked me, could I do it instead? And I said, I don't know anything about the physics of death, so I decided to give a lecture on the death of physics, which is a very different lecture. But to address your question more seriously, there's a close analogy, I think, with a clock. If a clock has stopped ticking, the clock isn't dead, it just needs to be wound up and restarted. And if you take certain microbes or even tardigrades, these extraordinary multi-celled organisms, and cool them down to liquid helium temperatures, they effectively stop working. They're sitting there. But if you warm them up again, they start up once again. However, and this comes up very much in the context of transfer of life between Earth and Mars. Space is a harsh environment. Inside a rock, a microbe in a dormant state is freeze-dried, and it could remain unharmed for quite a long period of time, but not forever. Eventually, the radiation damage would accumulate to the point where even if you warm it up again and put it in the ocean, it's not going to start up because it's got too much internal damage. And so the borderline between life and death is a very difficult one. If you were to say, compute, how much radiation dose a particular microorganism might suffer before it became non-viable, do that, from first principles. I don't think anyone knows how to do that. You can do the experiment. There are some resilient organisms like Deinococcus radiodurans that can survive immense doses of radiation and still repair the damage at the other end. So it depends actually on the organism. But you're quite right. We're just as uncertain about how to define death as we are to define life in the first place.
There is another interesting question in the chat, which is, could we consider the set of instructions or principle that inform a crystal or rock or whatever to not be dynamic and remain the same, to be a type of consciousness? This reminds me of a conversation between the Dalai Lama and David Bohm, on whether or not a rock is conscious. Surprisingly, perhaps it was the physicist who argued in favor of a rock's consciousness, not the Dalai Lama.
I once took part in a TV discussion in which we were talking about consciousness, and I said, repeated the argument I've just given here, which is that in my view, consciousness has something to do with complex dynamical processes. But I said, but you know, that not everybody thinks that. Some people think rocks are conscious. Well, some years later, a movie company contacted the TV company, who contacted me and said they would like to use an extract from this interview that I'd given. And I was sitting in a cinema one day trying to enjoy a film, and suddenly I appeared on the screen and said the words, "Rocks are conscious." And they had just taken that bit, you know, made me look really a bit weird, that here I'm saying rocks are conscious. So of course, the reason I'd said it was to point out that I didn't believe that. So it was taken very much out of context. So anyway, let me just reiterate that I do think the idea of panpsychism, so it's a very ancient one, but you know, every atom is a little bit conscious and a lot of atoms are a lot conscious. It really doesn't differentiate between a big chunk of matter like a mountain and a chunk of matter here. And I think there is a big difference. I think it's not just a matter of the stuff and even the complexity of the stuff. I think what makes a brain work in its distinctive way, what makes it consciousness, is the architecture of the feedback loops. And there are attempts to quantify this. There's something called integrated information theory, which is a sort of heroic attempt to quantify consciousness in terms of effectively those feedback loops. So it's a mathematical definition of consciousness based on the actual architecture of the information flow. And I think that's sort of in the right direction. And I think it's not enough just to sit there. And it's not enough just, you know, you think a box of gas is pretty complex. All those molecules banging around, 10 to the 23 degrees of freedom, lots of activity. You know, is it thinking great thoughts? Or space-time foam, you know, down at the Planck scale, you know, is all these quantum wormholes and bridges and baby universes and bubbles and so on down at that ultra microscopic scale. Is that having great thoughts? We can't know, but I personally don't think so. I think it's got to be not just complexity, but organized complexity to support consciousness.
Florian, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question? I'm saying this because I know Florian.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Professor Davies. I actually listened to your talk at the Science of Consciousness conference in
Yes.
I'm based at MIT, though. My question is related to different ways in which information could be encoded, and I mean, this is not my area of specialization, but I like to dabble in this, and so I can think of 3 different layers encoding information in a classical way, and I'm thinking Mike Levin's work on bioelectricity. I'm thinking about more quantum ways. The key word here would be Penrose and Hameroff, about the brain, and then maybe hitherto unknown ways to encode information. And I'm thinking about Harald Abmansbacher, dual aspect theory, the Pauli-Jung conjecture. Are there maybe physical principles that we don't know or understand yet? And so anyway, that could be the beginning of like a taxonomy or a classification. But I don't know whether there's any work in this regard or whether there's any way to think about this more systematically than it's done today.
Well, there is work, but of course a lot of it is very conjectural. Some of it, you know, is frankly mystical and incredible. The Tucson conferences bring together all of these. You know, from the crazy to the hard-nosed philosophers, neuroscientists, and you know, it's clear that people are giving it a lot of attention. I'll mention once again the Templeton World Charity Foundation, and of which I'm a trustee, that has this program. They have 2 programs. One is these different kinds of minds, but there's also one on consciousness. they've got $10 million in a program that tries to set up an adversarial approach. If you have, Smith's theory of consciousness and Jones' theory of consciousness, they better predict different things, otherwise they're the same theory. And if they predict different things, what experiments might we do that could discriminate between them? And so there's a heroic attempt there to actually do serious experiments to eliminate some theories of consciousness. But the field's wide open, and it sounds like you've given it a lot of thought yourself. My advice would be, feel free to develop some new thinking. When you get these tough problems, it's been around for thousands of years, you sort of get the impression the reason we're stuck is because we're thinking about the problem the wrong way. And that what we really need is a new conceptual framework. Maybe ask the questions a bit differently, or ask a different type of question, not what is consciousness, but what is agency or something like that, and how can agents emerge in a mechanistic world. And the Foundational Questions in Science Institute, which is part funded by Templeton as well, they also have a program of that nature, and there've been quite a number of quite good results. And if I just mention one that I found really useful, I don't know if he called himself a physicist, I think he's really more philosopher, Eric Hoel, H-O-E-L, a very nice paper he wrote called Agent Above, Atom Below, looking at the reconciliation of microdeterminism and the openness of agency on a large scale. So there is work being done, but I think it's not making a lot of progress at this time.
Fantastic, thank you.
Well, I have one final question, and I'd like to ask for advice. And we started talking about this in Rio, right? You've been a part of the astrobio community for a while, and astrobiology also wasn't a thing like 25 years ago, and there was a lot of resistance, and now it's becoming. So for us who are all as a group here trying to build community into the field of quantum biology, what's your advice for us? Like what lessons did you learn from the field of astrobiology that you think we could, how do we advance quantum biology in the best possible way, taking as your experience in astrobiology example?
Well, in astrobiology, it had the good fortune to get NASA funding at a critical point in history. At this point was after the discovery of a meteorite in Antarctica that comes from Mars, that for a while people thought contained traces of fossilized Martian organisms. It didn't, as it turns out, but it was enough to get people excited, enough to get Bill Clinton excited anyway. And NASA was then given a budget to create an astrobiology institute, a virtual institute, but it did have research programs, and they have every 2 years, they have a big conference, they bring people together. But in the early days, it was very much an exercise in getting people from different disciplines, because you obviously had astronomers and biologists, but you also had chemists and physicists and mathematicians and computer scientists and geoscientists, and all of these people often talking across purposes, different languages. Took a long while for the agenda to shape up, but it was helped because there are two journals, one called Astrobiology, the other the International Journal of Astrobiology, that began to establish a track record of papers addressing the issues. And although if you open those journals, almost all of them are addressing topics where the answer is, well, we don't know. They're all very conjectural, or it's very hard to say anything with precision. Nevertheless, they have served to create a sort of culture, an intellectual framework around which people can talk to each other, even if it remains very conjectural. So I think everybody could write down, and indeed the NASA Astrobiology Institute does write down, bullet points of what is astrobiology. It's this, it's that, it's that, it's that. So quantum biology would do well for that because it shades off, as I don't need to tell you, for everything from, is quantum mechanics playing an indispensable fundamental role in living matter? And I mean not just chemistry, but non-trivial quantum systems, all the way to, can we use quantum technology to correct, for medical, for therapeutic purposes, where the quantum nature of the technology is critical. Might be some sort of photon beam or something interacting with matter. We heard about that in Rio. If you bring that in under quantum biology, it's a whole sliding scale from quantum technology in the service of medicine all the way to the other end, quantum mechanics playing this foundational role in the nature of living matter. So something that would, I think, better define the subject area and make it as broad as possible, because there are some aspects which I think are quite well established. And then I think it would be better. And if there was a journal, perhaps, or at least a special, probably start with a special issue of a journal, and pick a journal that is perhaps already established, something in the realm of quantum mechanics, or quantum, that does a lot of quantum papers, and see if someone would produce a special issue. I think that would be a good first step.
I guess I also want to ask a question. If I don't ask, I will explode. So first of all, I want to show that we have one of Paul Davies' book here, The Demon in Machine. So it's in our library. So I strongly encourage you. I just posted the link to his books. Just have a look. There are so many interesting books. So my question is, okay, life began somewhere, and then with all this mess of chemistry, physics, and so on, do you think that the life is evolving in its more efficient way, or there is another way of evolution?
Well, when you look at the history of evolution of life on Earth, it's the only history we've got. Some people like to identify something like a ladder of progress or an acceleration in some quantity like algorithmic complexity or something of that sort. And there's a lot of dispute among biologists as to whether this is just a circular definition. It's certainly true that I showed the picture of the stromatolites. You know, if that's what life on Earth was like 3.5 billion years ago, it's obviously a lot better now. You look at a rainforest, and so it seems that there is a sort of arrow of complexity. But then it becomes more nuanced, because Stephen Jay Gould was fond of saying, had an argument that if you have a drunk who is propped up against a wall on a sidewalk, and then executes a random walk, the drunk ends up in the gutter, not because the drunk is aiming for the gutter, but because the movement in the other direction is limited by the wall. And so if life starts out simple and just randomly explores the possibility space, it's inevitable that it's going to get more complex over time. But it's not a directionality to greater complexity, it's just a diffusion into the possibility space. And when you look at the historical record, you can make a case for both. You can make a case, well, physicists might say it's a bit about like the difference between a wave packet spreading and a wave packet moving along. And of course, wave packets can move and spread at the same time. It's very hard to discern. We held an entire workshop on the evolution of complexity and produced a book called The Complexity of the Arrow of Time. It was published by Cambridge University Press. I co-edited it along with Sarah Walker. I think there was one other editor. And it's a series of papers based on our attempt to see, is there a sort of cosmic directionality towards greater complexity? The universe began with a big bang. It was very simple. Over time, there's been greater and greater gravitational complexity, more biological complexities. There a sort of hidden principle of the advance of complexity. A lot of people say there is. That's the sort of folklore. Yes, of course, it's getting more complex over time. But when you actually start to analyze this and boil it down to what's really going on, is there actually a principle at work? it's much less clear. And so the book concludes it's not proven at this stage. Now I think I've got to go.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I guess we don't have further questions, and it is better like to end the meeting here. So 1 hour and 20 minutes was very interesting. Thank you. Thanks everyone to attend. And I guess Natsumi will just announce the next lecture, and then we say goodbye to everyone. Thank you.
So the next lecture will be this Friday from the same time. It will be about chapter 3, Engines of Life. Okay, back to you, Abasalt.
So again, thanks everyone. Thanks Professor Davies for super interesting talk. And the talk is recorded, by the way. And do we have the YouTube link? Maybe we can share. So it will be uploaded to Qubit YouTube channel. So enjoy it. And again, have a look at Paul Davies's books that are super interesting. So
Yes,
see you. Yes. So see you everyone next Friday. The same time, 11 a.m. PST. Take care. See you. Bye.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Great to see you.
Bye-bye.
Virtually.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.